All right. Welcome to the middle of August, the dog days of summer. Maybe school is starting where you are, or maybe not yet. One thing I do know is that it's Minority Enterprise Development Week, and that's relevant to today's webinar because we're going to be discussing the decarbonization economy. Take a good look around because the winds of change are all around you. This shift will not only free us of carbon emissions and yield some of the largest capital gains that we've ever seen, but it will also revolutionize our entire economy. Now, here to dig more into this topic is someone who knows of what she speaks. Sarah Gutterman is the co-founder and CEO of Green Builder Media. She is a former venture capitalist and graduated cum laude from Dartmouth College and holds an MBA in entrepreneurship and finance from the University of Colorado. She has established a reputation as a visionary thought leader and passionate advocate for sustainability, and she works closely with a diverse group of stakeholders in the building industry to develop impactful, long-term green strategies that are simultaneously sustainable and profitable. Now, before we get started, I need to tell you about our sponsors today. Jinko Solar is a leading PV module manufacturer and energy storage system integrator. The company has deployed more than 75 gigawatts in 160 countries globally, including 14 right here in the US. Eagle modules come from facilities in Malaysia and Florida. Eagle Storage brings together the best energy storage technology for turnkey hardware and energy storage services. Publicly vetted by trusted industry third-party laboratories and top financial institutions, Eagle is a trusted choice for US solar and storage projects. Now, Rachio pioneered the smart watering category and created the first ever smart sprinkler controller. As a mission-driven company and a certified B Corp, Rachio is committed to making sustainable water use effortless and personally rewarding. Through automatic water skips that adjust sprinklers to real-time weather, Rachio has saved customers over 35 billion gallons of water and counting. Now, Uponor North America is the partner plumbing and HVAC professionals rely on for smart water and energy solutions. An award-winning manufacturer of PEX piping and the exclusive marketer and distributor of Uponor PP-RCT in North America, the company offers plumbing, fire safety, radiant heating and cooling, hydronic piping, and pre-insulated piping system solutions for new construction, retrofits, and remodels in both the residential and. Now, during the course of today's presentation, you can submit questions for Sarah. Simply use the questions box inside the GoToWebinar control panel. It's probably located on the right side of your screen. I'll review those questions and pose them to her during the Q&A time set aside after her presentation. Sarah, are you ready to delve deep into the decarbonization economy?
Oh, I am so ready, Mike. Thank you so much. I'm actually really thrilled and delighted to be able to present information about the Decarbonization Roadmap for the US and across the globe and the transition to the decarbonization economy. This is a topic that Green Builder Media is just absolutely bedding down on because it is where we have to go as a culture, as a species, as an economy. We're focusing all of our editorial, our demonstration projects, our webinars, our training and education on decarbonization and the many, many, many things that go along with that transition to a decarbonization economy. So I want to just start with a little bit of a mea culpa in terms of the fact that this is such a huge topic. There is no way that I'm going to be able to cover everything that has to do with decarbonization and the transition to a decarbonization economy. But what I can promise you is that if I get feedback from you all that you like this webinar and you want more, we can do more and make this really a decarbonization series so that we can touch on more aspects and really drill deeper into some of the concepts that I am presenting today. The other thing I want to say is all of the data and the research and the information that I'm going to present today comes from Green Builder Media and our Cognition Smart data. But it is the first time that I have gathered this together in hopefully a 1-hour webinar. So you're my guinea pigs. Bear with me a little bit since, as I said, this is the first time I've synthesized all this content together. to present it as a webinar. And really, truly, I would love your feedback. I'll give you my email address at the end of the webinar. Would love to hear what you thought worked, what didn't work, what flowed, what was missing. And again, as I said, I'm not going to try to cover everything related to decarbonization, but I think that hopefully we'll all leave today wanting more and at least having our thoughts and our minds provoked to think about this more deeply and hopefully collaborate and share ideas. So let me go ahead and start with what is decarbonization? It's really nothing less than the complete and full-scale elimination of carbon emissions, which will effectively require a complete overhaul of our socioeconomic system. That's really big, I know, but I think what's really interesting is that we're not trying to shoehorn sustainability into old systems, but we're really redesigning the economy with decarbonization. And the scale of this transformation is really on par with the Industrial Revolution and the digitization economy, which came with the advent of the internet. And ready or not, this transformation is happening. And as Mike said in his intro, not only will the decarbonization economy free us of carbon emissions and yield some of the largest capital gains that we've ever seen, but it really will revolutionize all sectors of our economy. Buildings, transportation, industry, agriculture, they will all fairly soon be green, clean, connected, electric, and resilient. And so not only is it exciting from an innovation and an imagination standpoint, but it's really exciting in terms of a financial opportunity standpoint. And so I think we're at a point now where naysayers and folks who maybe were not quite as convinced about the opportunity for financial gains, for job creation through the decarbonization economy are seeing that now we've surpassed price parity for things like renewable energy, heat pump technology, and other innovations that are going to take us to a decarbonized economy. And I think, and I'll talk about this later, corporations, investors, et cetera, are really seeing that there are better, more stable, and more reliable returns on sustainability investments than some traditional, we'll say, dirtier, even fossil fuel-based investments. So the numbers are there, they're penciling out. So how do we get there? Again, it's such a huge topic. There's so many elements that are going to contribute to this transformation. But some of the obvious and low-hanging fruit things include, one, the sequestering of existing emissions, meaning taking carbon out of the atmosphere and either putting that into land or ocean-based carbon sinks or into carbon tech, which I'll talk more about in a minute. It also has to do with understanding the emissions cycle. So there's embodied carbon that is emitted in the upfront extraction and, let's say, manufacturing and transportation of products and materials. There's operational carbon, which is generated in the actual use of buildings and vehicles. There's use stage carbon, so at various different parts of a product or a building's lifetime, it generates different kinds of carbon, it emits different kinds of carbon. There's end of life carbon. So there's kind of this whole cycle. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about that specifically with respect to buildings in a little while. But clearly, there are some low-hanging fruit elements that we can embrace fairly quickly with respect to the Decarbonization Roadmap. So things like conversion to renewable energy, electrification of everything, but particularly transportation, the transformation of industry and manufacturing, the transition of homes and buildings to net zero, all electric, healthy spaces, shifting our agricultural practices to regenerative practices that are just better and healthier for land, and then adopting more appropriate land use practices that either can enable land to be utilized for carbon sinks, but also to be more effective in those regenerative agricultural practices. And then, of course, rethinking development land use, right? So why are we building new developments in places that we know are going to get flooded or are going to experience major superstorms or hurricanes or wildfires? Maybe we should rethink some of those development practices. The decarbonization roadmap does include carbon offsets. I know that there are folks that just say carbon offsets are not the same as not emitting carbon in the first place, which is totally true and a valid argument. But I do think that they're a short-term strategy, at least to help get to a net, kind of a net zero level and level the playing field in the short term. And then carbon pricing, so setting a price on carbon that is emitted, so that there is a financial reason to stop emitting carbon and to motivate companies and countries and entities from actually emitting that carbon. That's all part of the decarbonization roadmap. So why do we need to decarbonize? I think that if you are attending this webinar today or watching the recorded version, you kind of get why we need to decarbonize, but let me just remind you. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is an entity within the United Nations, released a report last week that issued a very stark warning. They say that climate change is unequivocally here and the worst is yet to come. And the truth is, that's the good news, right? So this report said that, scientists from across the globe confirmed that human-induced carbon dioxide emissions are the main driver of intensifying climate change. And we need a full-scale elimination of greenhouse gas emissions to keep global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And if we surpass that threshold, we'll encounter irreversible impacts that will really lead to widespread species extinction and ecosystems collapse. Now, the report stated in no uncertain terms that, as I said, the worst is yet to come. Because as the planet warms, we can expect even more extreme temperatures, rising sea levels, intense superstorms, raging wildfires, extensive flooding, and severe drought. All of these things that we are already experiencing. But what the report, some of the kind of really alarming findings from the report are that, climate change is going to fundamentally reshape life on Earth in the coming decades. And it really depicted a very sobering picture of an unforgiving world if we do not immediately curb our fossil fuel addiction, cease destroying forests and ocean habitats, and transform our industrial and agricultural practices. And basically, if we don't do that, the scientists said that they kind of outlined this disastrous future in which billions of people suffer from starvation, from disease and other climate-related ailments. And unfortunately, the scientists went to a place where they said, look, life on Earth can recover from a drastic climate shift by evolving into new species and creating new ecosystems. That's what the Earth does. But humans cannot withstand that shift. Which really kind of brings me to a gnawing question that has been top of mind for me, and I know a lot of my friends in the sustainability sector, which is, is Paris enough? Is the Paris Accord and the commitments within that initiative to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century when compared to pre-industrial levels, is that enough? And I personally, and I'm not a climate scientist, but I know many climate scientists who do agree that it's really not, because we're already at a 1.1 degrees Celsius warming. And at our current trajectory, we are expected to pass 2 degrees Celsius within a shockingly short 5 years. 5 years. That's tomorrow. That is a blink of the eye. And I think that, these types of reports from IPCC and others really continue to show us that, not only have we impacted every ecosystem with human-based carbon generating activities, but that, these changes that are happening now are going to continue for hundreds of years, regardless of what we do now. Right, so oceans are going to continue to warm and acidify Glaciers are going to continue to melt, sea levels are going to continue to rise, even if we were to shut off fossil fuels tomorrow. And so with each passing day, we really creep closer and closer to a threshold where life as we know it is irreversibly changed. And the really sad truth is we may have passed that threshold already. Now, I am an optimist. I know it doesn't sound that way, but I really do believe that if we can cultivate the political will, the courage, the corporate innovation and ingenuity, the private sector imagination and push, then we can solve and mitigate for many of our climate issues. But we're going to have to act quickly, and we're going to have to act boldly. So let's talk about how we transform our future. Some of the main decarbonization drivers that are paving the way to the decarbonization economy include the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence. So the Internet of Things, which is basically the connection of everything, is facilitating change, enabling intelligent devices to remotely manage everything from manufacturing to building operations to vehicle fleets to power grids. And that's important because what that does is it optimizes resource efficiency and ultimately carbon emissions. And as the IoT proliferates, artificial intelligence technology is simultaneously being developed to monitor and solve for cybercrime, to enhance digital security across all systems and platforms. And that's really important as well, because obviously we're seeing a pretty dramatic increase in cybercrime that needs to be solved for. And so if IoT is going to expand and become even more prevalent in our system and in our economy, we've got to have that correspondence security layer as well. The next main driver for the decarbonization economy is the electrification of everything. And clearly we're seeing a just rapid and dramatic adoption of renewable energy. In fact, wind and solar energy are now cost competitive in most parts of the world and have actually surpassed fossil fuel energy. And clean energy technologies can now harvest more power using less space and fewer resources than ever before. So the numbers are there supporting solar and wind in particular. In fact, solar panels and wind turbines are about 40% more efficient than those produced about a decade ago. And the cost for both wind and solar has dropped by about 70% for wind and about 90% for solar over the past decade. And so fortunately, to our collective benefit, the better way, the more sustainable way has actually become the more economical way. And so as we see power generation become more distributed and localized with things like load management, optimized demand-side energy management, we're going to see more efficiency and frankly, a corresponding decrease in carbon emissions. We're also seeing leaps and bounds advances in battery storage that are helping to fulfill the promise of distributed energy generation, because one of the problems, as we know, of wind and solar is that, that there's no, if you're grid connected and the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing, you can't access that power. So you need that battery storage. But the advances in battery storage are not only enabling us to actually distribute energy and fulfill that promise, as I said, but also it's kind of signaling the end of gas guzzling internal combustion engines, because certain experts predict that economies of scale will bring down the cost of batteries to allow electric vehicles to reach price parity with gas-powered vehicles by as soon as 2024. Again, tomorrow, that's right around the corner. And those battery innovations are being led by companies like QuantumScape, which is developing solid-state batteries that are really revolutionizing that battery sector and bringing the watt-hour cost of battery storage down by 70–75%. We're also seeing the advancement of sophisticated software that can manage and monitor and optimize battery storage systems. allowing that seamless sharing of energy between homes and buildings and vehicles and devices and the grid. And I think that we can kind of count on DC power becoming the norm in the decarbonization economy, which allows for that streamlined power generation, storage, and usage and sharing, rather than having to convert DC power to AC power, which is what's happening right now in the standard electricity format. So pretty exciting what's happening on the battery side of things. Also, I am keeping my eye on vehicle to grid technologies, which basically allow a two-way or bidirectional sharing of energy from the grid to electric vehicles, so that electric vehicles can actually become battery systems for homes or for builders and contractors. You can power up your tools and run your tools through your Ford F-150 electric truck. But also these smart charging software platforms are going to allow EVs to charge when there is available energy from the grid, so that we don't overwhelm the grid, which we're seeing happen more and more in especially places like California and other places. Texas, we saw, that major grid failure last winter. So that vehicle to grid technology is also very important. And then the last driver that I want to mention up front is just everything becoming more connected, intelligent, self-sufficient, and resilient. So homes, buildings, communities, the whole built environment will soon become mini microgrids and virtual power plants. And we're already seeing this in places like Germany, that I would say is probably the most advanced with respect to utilizing any kind of rooftop, commercial structures, homes, barns, anything to generate power. So every rooftop is considered to be an opportunity for power generation. And with this kind of distribution of decentralized power, we'll have that enhanced resiliency and stability, which again is paramount as natural disasters like wildfires and superstorms are taking out our grid infrastructure with increasing frequently. And as utilities are forced to implement rolling brownouts during periods of extreme weather. So let's talk about carbon tech. All right, so this is one of the most exciting areas of the transition to a decarbonization economy, because this is really where the innovation, the biggest innovation is occurring. We're seeing a lot of venture capital investments in carbon tech companies. And this, I think, is really the carbon tech sector is going to really represent some of those breakthrough innovations that are going to just transform our economy. So there's this whole new wave of carbon reduction technology that is emerging. It's called carbon tech, that's capable of basically capturing and embedding large amounts of carbon into the ground, into rocks, into soils, and into the products around us, with the goal of decreasing emissions and decreasing our collective carbon footprint or environmental footprint. And there's a couple of different elements to carbon tech. First, there's direct air capture. So there's a couple companies, two that I'm tracking, called one Carbon Engineering and the other is called ClimateWorks, that are among the most prominent companies attempting direct air carbon capture at scale. And basically this approach pulls carbon out of the air through massive fans and sends it through a liquid or a solid filter to remove the carbon dioxide, the carbon. And in those companies are storing that carbon underground. There are some other companies that are actually literally making rocks or other materials, natural materials out of that carbon. It's basically allowing us to it has the potential to allow us to turn back the clock on carbon emissions by taking that carbon out of the air. I do want to say that while direct air capture has a lot of potential, the systems are very expensive right now. Frankly, they're a lot more expensive than, say, planting trees, which is a natural solution to carbon sequestration. But there's a lot of money going into this sector. There are a lot of other companies other than those two that are trying to tackle this. And there are a few examples. For example, Sweden has a direct air capture power plant system, a utility scale system that seems to be fairly effective. And so, I think it's an emerging technology. I would not call it proven at this point. But again, a lot of money going into the development of direct air capture solutions. And so, we'll see how long it takes for that technology to evolve. There's another layer to carbon tech, which is carbon utilization. So it's not just taking carbon out of the air and sequestering it into the ground or into rocks, but actually using that carbon for a functional purpose for products, from building materials to plastics to fabrics to vehicles. And the vision of products made with carbon utilization is really having products that are fundamentally similar in makeup and function and application, but no emissions are released during their manufacturing process. So, huge available market, as I mentioned, these are just massive returns, on the horizon. So just the carbon utilization market is projected to have about a $1 trillion per year annual revenue rate in the US alone, and about 6 trillion globally. So, clearly a big opportunity on an annualized basis. There's a couple of interesting companies, I'm gonna really just focus on one right now, that are producing carbon tech products using carbon utilization in the built environment. And the one I wanna highlight right now is called Carbon Cure. And basically what Carbon Cure does is it takes carbon from the air, it combines it with a cement mix to create a more structurally sound concrete. So not only is that concrete more sustainable, but it's actually more structurally durable. And so these kinds of innovations are really important, especially in sectors like concrete and steel and asphalt that have a really highly intensive manufacturing and production process. Now, we are starting to see some government incentives to spur the carbon tech sector. So the Biden administration is offering tax incentives. They've actually allocated about $20 million to companies that have sequestered or reused carbon in products. And about $6 billion has been earmarked for companies that are developing carbon capture, storage, and utilization technologies. I think perhaps though, the most interesting thing about carbon tech is that it really provides an economic incentive to capture carbon particles rather than release them into the atmosphere. So it motivates utilities and manufacturers to develop innovative ways to take what has been a polluting gas, a polluting material, and convert it into a valuable raw material that actually has a price. And so that changing valuation metric really transformed conventional thinking to think about carbon as an asset instead of a harmful planet heating gas. And so that I think is really interesting. In terms of scaling carbon tech, I do think that there's going to have to be some incentives. We have seen the introduction of the SCALE Act by the House that would really help to incentivize carbon tech and would allocate approximately about $5 billion nationwide to carbon tech technologies. Now, one note, I do think that carbon tech faces a steep road ahead. These are all new technologies. They will likely take a long time to kind of meaningfully realize themselves and to penetrate the market. They're fairly capital intensive, and the real truth is that carbon tech's main competitor, the fossil fuel industry, really isn't known for fighting fair. So we have to take all of those things into consideration as well. But again, lots of opportunity and I think really some exciting transformation here. Now let's shift to the built environment. Built environment, I think, as we all know, is really one of the most conspicuously consumptive industries, and it has a tremendous impact on carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions because the sourcing and manufacturing of materials, the construction, and then the ongoing operations of homes and buildings requires an immense amount of energy and emits a substantial amount of carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, the Department of Energy estimates that homes and buildings in the US account for about 40% of our nation's total energy use and about 70% of our electricity use and generates about 40% of our carbon emissions. So, clearly it's impactful. It's also estimated that if all buildings in the US were net zero embodied carbon, so all aspects of that life cycle of carbon, then we could reduce our emissions by more than 50%. So again, that includes extraction, transportation, construction, operations, and end of life. The UN climate, the group of climate scientists that work for the UN, they avow that emissions from buildings have to be reduced by about 50% by 2030 and 100% by 2050 if we have any chance whatsoever at staying under a 1.5 degree temperature rise. So where are we in the building industry? And I think that we are seeing this ugly trifecta of lumber shortages, which are adding about 36,000, rising lumber costs. I didn't mean lumber shortages, although there are some shortages, but rising lumber costs are adding about 36,000 to the average American home right now. We're seeing material shortages, which are expected to last through 2021 and into 2022. And then ongoing labor challenges, which really had plagued the building industry before COVID and was facilitated and exacerbated by COVID. And 60% of the building professionals that we survey are grappling with labor challenges. So this trifecta of these three things is really forcing a transformation in the built environment that frankly is, I think, going to be good for decarbonization and sustainability, because it's really forcing building professionals and developers and builders and designers and architects and contractors and energy raters, and all the manufacturers that serve the building industry to really rethink complex challenges. And I think what's happening is, we're seeing folks move towards what used to be called alternative building envelope systems. So things like insulated concrete forms and structural insulated panels, as well as panelized systems, and even all the way through prefab and 3D printing, 3D printed structures. And, I think that a lot of those systems have sustainability in their DNA. I think that they are inherently higher performance, more resilient, and frankly, higher quality than conventional stick framing, because first, especially if you're looking at prefab or factory-built panelized systems, these systems are made in a factory under strict, and tightly controlled conditions. It's not like you're, trying to build on site where you have to deal with wind and weather and rain, heaven knows whatever else happens on job sites these days. And so there's more quality control. It's a tightly controlled setting. There's performance optimization in a factory, right? You can really utilize and implement the best building science practices in that controlled setting. Of course, there's waste management, and in theory, at least, prefab and panelization can help keep construction schedules on time and really reduce material shortages. And prefab and panelization can help solve for some labor issues. Of course, you do have, on-site infrastructure and site work that needs to be done, even if you're doing a full-scale prefab home, but at least you're cutting out some of the labor issues. And so, I think that there's the ability to take advantage of economies of scale, faster speed. We all know time is money for builders and developers, and that improved quality control, really kind of enhancing the sustainability of these structures. Now, I'm showing a little sneak peek into the first ever Green Builder Media branded prefab home that we're just about to release with a prefab builder in California called Devell. We think that Devell has the most sustainable product on the market anyway, and we've worked with them to incorporate some additional products and systems. We're looking at full, zero carbon homes by looking at environmental product declarations for all of the products that we use in that home. Now, I will say we're still a little early to be able to get EPDs for all of the products that we're using in the home. There are just some categories like doors that they just don't have it yet. But we're not only encouraging our partners to get EPDs or some kind of equivalent, but we're also working with them so that if they don't have an EPD or equivalent, we can work with them to help figure out what their carbon utilization is. And then we'll buy offsets and we'll use electric vehicles for transportation so that we can really try to create net zero carbon homes. So again, staying in the built environment, the way that we get to decarbonization is not only these alternative building envelope systems and things like prefab and 3D printing, but also through enabling technologies like solar, like heat pump technologies, like induction cooktops, high performance windows and building envelope systems, cool roofs. There's some really cool technology out there that we're keeping our eye on to help solve for water availability issues that are called hydro panels. They're atmospheric generators that basically pull water out of the air, and they kind of look like solar panels, but they generate water. And the chart on the right of this slide is kind of a neat one. We surveyed our readers, our consumer audience, and clearly there's interest in living in net zero homes because of the economic payback and the cost savings, and then of course the environmental impact reduction. But I think that consumers are getting savvier and they understand the cost benefit of net zero. We cannot have a conversation about decarbonization and getting to a net zero all electric built environment until, unless we talk about a couple of just pivotal technologies. One, of course, is solar. And, the good news is that the clean energy future is here, right? We don't have to wait for it. It's already here. If you look at our existing utility scale and rooftop PV solar capacity, we have enough basically to, we have about 284 million gigawatts of electricity capacity each year, which is the equivalent to 78 times of our electricity use in 2020. So, we have what we need. Any argument to the contrary is frankly just not correct. This is not my analysis or my numbers. This comes from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, and is backed up by everyone from Rocky Mountain Institute to Environment America. So these numbers are real. I didn't just make them up. And it's really because, as I said earlier, today's solar panels and wind turbines produce more energy in less space for less cost with more flexibility than ever before. And today's solar panels, as an example, are about 40% more efficient than those produced a decade ago and cost about 90% less. Similar numbers for wind as well. In fact, something that's really worth noting is that power sourced from wind and solar is now less expensive than power produced by fossil fuels on a national scale. And it's actually now less expensive to build new onshore wind and utility scale solar power generation facilities than it is to operate existing fossil fuel facilities. So think about that for a minute. I mean, that's a huge, massive change, and is guaranteed to upend our power generation sector, right, the utility sector. And, unlike solar and wind, which grew by about 900 and 300% respectively over the past decade, fossil fuel companies are finding themselves on a downwards trajectory. In those same 10 years, where solar and wind saw colossal growth, coal generation has decreased by about 80 gigawatts, which represents enough energy to power about 43 million homes in the US. And we're seeing, a lot of these oil behemoths like ExxonMobil and Chevron starting to report disappointing quarterly earnings on a more regular basis. So, again, we're really there in terms of, that transition to renewable energy. And then last thing I'll say on that topic is, some of the recent advances in battery technology would make Star Trek fans like my brother really proud. Anodes made out of pure lithium metal, cathodes comprised of inexpensive high manganese and lithium metals used with liquid electrolytes, all of which really increase capacity and decrease costs. So lots of transformation there. We also really can't have a conversation about the transition to decarbonization without talking about heat pumps. You can see, heat pumps, they basically leverage the differential between the temperature inside and outside of a home or a building, and then exhaust heat or cooling, depending on what you're looking for based on the seasons. They use about a third of the energy for air and water heating and cooling than some of the conventional HVAC and water heating technologies. And that's a big deal because heating and cooling really account for about 10% of our national greenhouse gas emissions. And a lot of the weaknesses that some of the older heat pump technologies had, because heat pumps have been around, for 30 years, but now they're just reaching a tipping point in the US, really due to a blend of these enhanced technologies, codes, incentives, and then also consumer awareness. You can see in that chart another reader survey, a huge portion of our readers, and again, it's a sophisticated group of early adopter and first mover readers, but they're very interested in heat pump technologies because they get, again, on the bottom left, the cost savings, the energy efficiency, et cetera. But a lot of these new heat pump technologies eliminate some of the weaknesses that some of the older heat pump technologies had. And then we're also overcoming a lot of those, kind of challenges like, huge upfront costs, installation and setup challenges where contractors just weren't familiar with it, as we've seen greater acceptance and also availability. So, all of those technologies, the enabling technologies I've mentioned, things like solar and heat pumps are transitioning us to a net zero energy environment. And we're seeing the ROI of net zero homes. They may have a little bit of a increased upfront cost, but the payback period is short. And, they really do start yielding an ROI, very early, if not on, the first day of move-in. They also offer just a better experience for occupants, lower cost of home ownership, and higher resale value in a lot of markets. And then, we're all, along with the movement towards net zero is the movement towards electrification. And going all electric is not a new concept in our country. About 37% of homes nationwide are all electric, according to the US Energy Information Administration. A lot of those are in the South, but we're starting to see many municipalities in the West. I think there's, nearly 45 to 50 municipalities throughout California, and then also into, Oregon, even into Texas and New Mexico, Colorado, that are implementing codes and or incentives to shift to all electric and shift away from natural gas hookups. And that's partly because, we're seeing data and studies that show that all electric homes can save homeowners up to, about $300 per year. And that's according to the Rocky Mountain Institute. But getting to net zero energy really isn't enough if we're going to hit our climate goals. We really have to get to net zero carbon, right? So, as I've said already, the built environment plays a major role in carbon emissions, the sourcing and manufacturing of materials, the construction process itself, the operation of homes and buildings. All of this requires, a great deal of energy and emits carbon. So, I really believe that in order to get to a carbon-free or even carbon negative built environment, we really have to expand our thinking beyond net zero energy and look at operational efficiency, look at the embodied carbon, look of products that we're utilizing, look at transportation emissions, and then look at again, operation and end of life phases. And, we really do have a long road to travel in the built environment because only about 1% of existing buildings are considered net zero carbon today. And, clearly that's a far cry from getting to net zero carbon by 2050. So, some experts like Ed Mazaria with Architecture 2030 argues that we're going to have codes in order to get us there. I don't think I disagree with him because codes are the baseline. And he and other folks that we know and are friends with are working on what's called a zero code, which is really a stretch energy code that would achieve net zero carbon operations for all new buildings immediately and a 65% reduction in operational carbon by 2030. A 40% reduction in embodied carbon for new structures and 65% in major renovations by 2030, and then zero emissions completely for the whole built environment by 2040. So again, that's very aggressive. However, it's not a moonshot because the state of Oregon has already adopted the zero code, and it's currently under consideration in California for adoption in the next code cycle. So, we'll see. Those are aggressive goals, I know, but attainable. Now, we really can't talk about decarbonization economy unless we talk about market demand, consumer demand in particular. And as I've mentioned earlier, consumers are becoming increasingly more savvy. They're demanding sustainable solutions that solve for our climate emergency. As we survey our readers, about 86% of women and 81% of men say that they will, they prefer to buy from companies that demonstrate a commitment to sustainability. Clearly, millennials and Gen Zs who have seized the top influencer position in the housing market, spending more money on buying and remodeling homes than any other age group, have an inherent ethic of sustainability. They're willing to pay more for environmentally sustainable products. They also are looking for, kind of life and work scenarios that are meaningful and that are sustainable. And I think the cool thing about millennials and Gen Zs is that they are inherent disruptors. They like to do things differently, and it really should come as no surprise that they, really are going to, work hard. They're going to, do everything that they can. They're going to go out and march and demonstrate to make sure that they have a sustainable future for themselves and for their families. This is a generation that really prioritizes purpose over paycheck, and they want their work and their lives to really be meaningful and contribute to the world. And given that by 2025, 75% of the workforce will be comprised of millennials, it's important to understand, what they want, what they value. They like deep relationships, they like social purpose and social equity. Certainly they're digital natives. A lot of folks in this age group have shifted to a plant-based diet. They're vegan, they're vegetarian, they're looking to create net zero personal budgets. So it's, a really different mindset, and that is really helping to contribute to this transition to the decarbonization economy. And, partly in response to that consumer demand, but also partly in, response to just their own kind of moral directive, corporations are really stepping up and leading the private sector to set very aggressive net carbon goals. I think that we've really seen a multitude of multinational corporations that are kind of in this competition to become the sustainability leaders in their sectors, making very aggressive commitments to becoming net neutral with respect to energy, water, materials, emissions waste, operations, packaging, and mobility in the next decade. You know, and sustainability is really now a moral imperative. And that's, you know, it's neat to see that corporations across the globe are stepping up. You know, we're seeing behemoths like Amazon, Best Buy, IBM, Microsoft, Schneider Electric, and others, you know, pledge to go net zero carbon by 2040. We're seeing companies like Whirlpool and Facebook that have made global commitments to reach net zero emissions in plants and operations and convert to 100% renewable energy by 2030. Bosch already hit a benchmark of achieving carbon neutrality in 400 worldwide locations. And they have more aggressive plans to reduce emissions across its entire value chain by 2030. The automotive companies are playing as well. They're also in the game, you know, so Volvo and GM have pledged to electrify their entire product line by 2040, while simultaneously eliminating carbon from their manufacturing and operations and supply chain, and sourcing renewable energy, and also purchasing carbon offsets. So, you know, again, a lot of interesting things. One more note, Microsoft, this is pretty cool. So not only have they committed to becoming carbon negative by 2030, but they have also pledged to find ways to remove all of the carbon that the company has emitted since its inception. So that's pretty important. But, you know, perhaps one of the biggest and let's say one of the loudest voices shifting the financial dynamics away from, you know, fossil fuel and kind of non-sustainable investments is BlackRock CEO Larry Fink, who's really been a major contributor to the transformation of global investment policy, shifting trillions of dollars away from carbon-intensive polluting industries like fossil fuels towards sectors that are carbon neutral and regenerative and sustainable and clean. And, you know, when the man who manages the world's largest fund of about $7 trillion says that change is afoot and then puts his money where his mouth is, you know, people really listen. And, you know, we're also seeing major divestment from fossil fuels, which the whole divestment movement started in 2014 as a series of campus protests. But it's, you know, grown by about 1,200%, with $6 trillion already committed to reallocation into, you know, sustainable technologies and carbon tech technologies. So that's, you know, clearly a lot going on there. You know, Green Builder Media recognizes every year some what we call eco leaders, so companies that are doing great green things in the world. I encourage you, if you haven't seen it yet, to check out our July-August issue of Green Builder magazine. That's our this year's eco leaders issue. We have companies like Carbon Cure, I mentioned them. We've got folks like Climate First Bank, which is kind of revolutionizing the lending sector. I mentioned the prefab home company Devel that we're partnering with. H2 Green Steel is another favorite of mine. They're addressing, you know, the highly intensive production process of steel. And then I love this company Lilium, which is electric air taxis for short range travel. So you can read more about those companies in our July-August issue. A couple of other companies that I just want to call out that we work with that are in that Eco Leaders issue. Jinko Solar, you know, they're one of the world's largest PV manufacturers, so they are inherently leading the transition to the decarbonization economy because of the sector that they're in. But not only do their products really, you know, play a pivotal role, but also their corporate commitments. So they're part of the RE100 commitment, which is a collection of companies that have committed to go 100% renewable by 2025. They were the first solar company to join that initiative, which I like because it's got a lot of public information disclosure requirements to hold those entities accountable to be transparent. Also, Jinko's looking for alternative energy sources across its entire operations and manufacturing, so hydro and solar mostly, and they're also paying a lot of attention to kind of sourcing local materials, shipping logistics, which is not only decreasing their footprint, but it's saving them money, which is great. Let's have a blended bottom line. Uponor is another company that I really like to highlight because, first of all, they have really innovative products like radiant heat systems, fire protection systems, which is really top of mind for me because I live in the remote mountains of Colorado. Wildfire is our biggest fear and challenge here. They've also got super durable PEX piping, plumbing manifold systems. And then they were one of the initial partners. It was a joint venture between Uponor and Belkin to create FIN, which is a leak detection and water management system, which has really revolutionized the concept of intelligent water in our homes. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It's PHYN. Really incredible product for water management in our homes, which is a whole other webinar that I can give another time. But, Uponor does a lot to reduce their carbon emissions. They're adopting renewable energy use. They're also pursuing full transparency and things like EPDs for their products, which is really important. And they're also implementing science-based targets for decarbonization of the company. We also really love working with Rachio, another company in the intelligent water space, but Rachio kind of revolutionized the smart sprinkler space, enabling homeowners not only to control their outdoor irrigation from a smartphone or a tablet remotely, which is really important because not only does that save on water, substantially, but it also allows these controllers to interact with soil so that flowers or yards are getting exactly the amount of water they need when they need it. So again, massive water savings, which contributes to substantial carbon emission savings. And then Rachio is also really doing a lot to reduce their carbon footprint. Things like encouraging their customers to actually mow less and not use fertilizers and to use drought-resistant vegetation all the way through to, kind of creating these innovative technologies that can help, decrease carbon emissions. Now, just a couple more slides. I'm probably going to run a little bit over, so sorry about that, but just bear with me. Maybe go 5 minutes over the hour, but a couple more important things to note. First of all, we can't have a transition to a decarbonized economy without government involvement. So, fortunately, the Biden administration has set some pretty aggressive goals to eliminate carbon emissions by 2050, to go 100%, net zero carbon by 2050 and to get to about 50% by 2030. So the way to get there, according to the Biden administration, is, putting money into green infrastructure and innovation, obviously adopting renewable energy, creating clean jobs, electrifying transportation and buildings, incentivizing energy efficiency upgrades, making sure that everyone across the country has access to clean air and clean water, developing standards and programs to support this transition, rethinking our agricultural practices, et cetera. So that's all good. I will say that the infrastructure bill or proposal did actually, the kind of last version jettisoned a lot of clean energy provisions, and it actually includes money for carbon capture technologies that basically kick the can down the road with respect to the fossil fuel industry, because the real truth is, and I said this earlier, we need to get away from fossil fuels and the burning of fossil fuels. Even if we can capture emissions, we just need to get away from that. We need to get away from the problem before it starts, rather than trying to capture carbon, either as it's emitted in a smokestack or after it's in the atmosphere. And so, it's really important that we don't spend too much money on prolonging the burning of fossil fuels by cleaning up carbon that is emitted, but rather shifting away from those fossil fuels. And another thing to note is that, obviously this doesn't come down to just the US. We've got to have an all hands on deck global effort. So, fortunately, a lot of European countries and even the European Union are adopting pretty aggressive policies and codes and even laws. So, France and Britain and China and India have all announced intentions to phase out combustion engine vehicles as early as 2035. Germany, which is all in on renewable energy, as I mentioned earlier, has decreased its emissions by 23% since 1990. There's a lot of examples of companies making bold commitments, probably more aggressive even than the US at this point. Verdict is out whether or not these countries are going to back up those commitments with real action. But I do think that a lot of the European countries will. I think France and the United Kingdom, Switzerland, I think, Denmark and Finland, they're already there. But some good examples for us to draw from at the very least. So here's my last slide. So bear with me as I philosophize a little bit, because it is showtime right now, right? It is the moment of truth. And the cold, hard truth is that, we're really not even close to meeting our goals that we stated in the Paris Agreement. And I say this because not this recent report from the UN, but one from a couple of weeks ago analyzed the climate efforts of 75 nations across the globe that are major carbon emitters. And unfortunately, the current plans submitted by these countries would really only cut global greenhouse gas emissions by about 1% by 2030. And that is a frighteningly far cry from the 45% cut we need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So there's a big deficit. And, with climate change wreaking havoc across the globe, we really have to shift climate action, kind of downshift into go mode, into imperative mode, because the window for action to safeguard our planet is closing pretty quickly. So we've got to galvanize the global community before it's too late. We've got to, implement every program and idea and piece of innovation and investment that we possibly can, because the reality is that extreme weather events are intensifying faster than scientific models predicted, and really bringing us into uncharted territory. And so with each passing year, more heat and fire and flooding and superstorm records are broken. And scientists predict that we're actually trending ever faster towards greater extremes. So that kind of leads me to this silver bullet question. Can we marshal the courage in the next 5 to 10 years to develop the solutions that we need to successfully address our impending climate emergency? And will we allow ourselves to fully redesign our economy with massive disruption and groundbreaking innovation on par with the Industrial Revolution and the digitization economy? It can be a little daunting and a little scary, but in theory, we can absolutely get there, especially if we focus now on the low-hanging fruit solutions like a vehicle electrification, wide-scale adoption of renewable energy, wind and solar in particular, the deployment of advanced technologies like heat pumps and induction cooking, high-performance building envelope systems. With those things alone, we can really hit a dramatic reduction in emissions by 2030. And then, it gives us a little bit more time to tackle some of these more challenging areas in the next, 10 to maybe 15 years. But, really make no mistake, we are in a pivotal defining moment, and it's really up to us to decide if it becomes an awakening or just a traumatic opportunity lost. Because, we are, all of us, responsible for the shaping of our society, of our economy, and of our future. And, we could choose to continue to prop up an obsolete status quo that perpetuates social and environmental and economic injustice, really a state of normal that never deserved to work. But we could also choose a different future, And perhaps it's time for us to really rewrite that future and embrace the spark of clarity that comes with the calamity of climate change, because that's really what it is. And, so really the next era in America and across the globe is unfolding before our eyes. And, what awaits us in the future is very different than anything that we have experienced before. And there's really no return to, quote, normal. I talk with my friends and they say, oh, wildfire, superstorms, extreme temperature, when are we going to get back to normal? There is no return to normal. And like the caterpillar and the butterfly, this process of transformation is going to be cathartic, difficult, and also beautiful. And it'll be, this metamorphosis is going to be at times painful and confusing, but it's inevitable. And it's really time. It's time to reorder our world and time to embrace decarbonization as a pathway to resilience and healing and sustainability. And it's time to recraft a system that facilitates social, economic, and environmental sustainability. So I'm going to wrap it there. I think maybe, Mike, I'm going to hand it back to you. If there are any questions, maybe we can just take a couple and take about 10 more minutes for questions. And really want to thank everyone for listening. Thanks for indulging me for the last couple of minutes as I philosophized. I hope it came through that I'm excited. There are some major challenges. There are some, very real realities that we need to address and just be aware of. But there's so much opportunity. So thanks for being here with me today. Thanks for being my guinea pig as I tested out this webinar. I invite you please to, shoot me an email, tell me what you think, what worked, what didn't work, what was missing, what you want to hear more about. If I get enough feedback, then I'll do more of these decarbonization webinars, drilling down into other areas. And with that, Mike, why don't we go to questions?
Yep, we've got a couple of questions in the time we have left, Sarah. So the first one we're going to take is from Robert. He wanted to know, why is China exempt from compliance with the Paris Climate Accord?
So I don't know that China is exempt. The good news about the Paris Accord is that it's the first time that, countries, the Kyoto Protocol notwithstanding, and I'm not including that because, like Paris, it wasn't, it didn't end up becoming a binding accord. The good thing about the Paris Agreement is that it's facilitated conversation between countries to make bold commitments and to take action to mitigate the risk of climate change. The bad news about the Paris Agreement is that it's not binding. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that anyone is exempt or not exempt because it's not a binding agreement. There's really no, kind of financial or, kind of legal or punitive actions that can be taken against a country if they don't fulfill their commitments. It's really peer pressure, right? That's kind of what the Paris Agreement boils down to. The Biden administration, when at first, kind of was elected and in office, within the first couple of weeks, President Biden sat down with China to kind of work out an agreement and lay out a framework for both countries to meet their goals as stated in the Paris Agreement. And Biden is now negotiating similar agreements with countries like, Japan and a whole spectrum of different countries. And so, again, it's a little bit of a slippery and tricky question because no one is exempt, but no one is also not exempt from fulfilling these commitments because of the way that accord has been crafted. A lot of sustainability experts and climate scientists would like to see an agreement put in place that does actually have real measures, real economic measures and, elements of, kind of punitive steps that can be taken against countries that don't hit their goals. But, I think, again, the way that Paris is set, it's really a, kind of a peer pressure and, country by country based, plan to have each country follow through with its commitment.
Sarah, there were a couple questions that came in, and it had to do with the section you were talking about with end of life and what are we going to do. And so, the first question is there going to be a supply issue with the raw materials needed to manufacture PV panels and/or batteries, or are we going to be able to possibly salvage some quote old PV panels or batteries? And really, that's kind of the crux of another question as well, which is, okay, you have PV panels, one of them is faulty or end of life. Are there recycling programs, or what do we do when we get to end of life? So it's kind of a combination question of raw materials, of all the things that we're going to need to move in this direction, and can we look to some of those early adopters who had some of these materials, or sorry, some of these products, to repurpose those materials?
Yeah, great question. So the truth is that, yes, we will likely hit some shortages in terms of raw materials and inputs for solar panels. And that is partly because of the type of materials that go into solar panels right now. It's also partly because of where those materials are being extracted. A lot of the raw input material for solar panels comes from certain areas in China. And right now, the US and Chinese government are playing a little bit of a game of chicken with respect to some specific provisions around the raw material sourcing and the manufacturing of solar panels. And I'm not going to go into too much detail. Feel free to write me an email if you want to hear more. It's very complex and will take more time than we have to, in this Q&A session. But because of, again, where those materials are being sourced right now, and the fact that, they're not being sourced on a global scale in many different areas, there may be some sourcing issues, partly because of availability, but again, also partly because of politics. The answer to that is to look at innovating raw materials for solar panels, which is a lot easier for me to say on this webinar than to do, just because, again, I'm not a client scientist, nor am I a solar panel engineer. So I can have all kinds of ideas, but, putting that into reality is, far beyond my pay grade. And so, I think that there may very well be some shortages, and you'll see some innovations to address those shortages, possibly using different types of materials for solar panels, and then also other innovations that could potentially just create efficiencies in terms of not necessarily changing materials, but using those materials in a more effective way. In terms of take-back programs for solar panels, and kind of recycling of those materials, again, it's a complex process. And I know of companies that are working on it. I don't know currently of a full-scale take-back and panel recycling program right now. But I absolutely suspect that just as appliance companies are looking at take-back programs in order to recycle components within appliances, that solar panel companies are going to crack that nut pretty quickly.
Gotcha. Well, we are at time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up there. But we did have a couple questions come in that we will pass along to you, Sarah, for follow-up post-webinar, if you're okay with that.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
All right. So thank you, Sarah, very much for sharing your time with us today, and thank you to the audience. I'm sorry we couldn't get to every question, but we will, just a little bit of a time delay. Thank you also to Jinko Solar, Rachio, and Uponor North America for their generous sponsorships of this webinar. And we're going to be right back here next Wednesday, August 25th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for a Housing 2.0 related webinar. You're going to need to grab your surfboard and be ready to hang 10 as we go environmental surfing with Vivian Lofness of Carnegie Mellon University. Don't forget your sunscreen. Until next time, hang loose, everyone. See ya.